Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Dead on the Money podcast, where two financial advisors try to make personal finances a little less spooky. My name is Richard Coffin. I'm joined by my co-host, Derek Deadman. It is October, the month of Halloween, very on brand for our podcast, and we figured it was appropriate to have an on-brand topic for today in this spooky season, the discussion of the cost of dying. That sounds great in post, I said. Yeah, we can't hear right
the
now.
Awkward
but,
silence.
Yeah, that's right. But that'll sound great to the podcast listeners and the YouTube viewers. But yeah, this is a discussion we've always had the idea of covering. Like it comes naturally with the idea of the channel.
Yeah, I think it was a comment in in the first video, maybe.
Oh,
or
maybe
even an
yeah.
intro, or we came on our list, or we came up on it our own.
We had an idea. I think the discussion was this could be the first video we post.
That's where it was, yeah.
But then we figured a more broad discussion of money was probably warranted. But something that a lot of people don't think about until, unfortunately, you're in the grim circumstance. And then in addition to dealing with the grief and these things, you're also slapped with these very high bills, as we'll discuss. So very appropriate topic, given our last names, something we've, again, wanted to cover for a while. And something that goes beyond, most people don't think about these costs until it's a little too far down the line or you're facing them explicitly. But beyond what most people expect, there are a lot of costs that go beyond just funeral and expenses. And maybe you can talk to that quickly.
Yeah, no, but it definitely an appropriate topic. I remember when you first joined the firm, I think it took us a little bit to even realize like how co-branded our last names were like meant to be.
I didn't know how yours was pronounced. That played
That's
a role
right,
for sure. Yeah,
but I think kind of there was always the joke that if finance didn't work for us, we could open our own
funeral
funeral parlor or whatever.
I don't know if that's too on the nose though.
Yeah,
right?
I know,
like
Deadman and Coffin. They would think it would I don't know if anybody would believe.
That's right. Yeah, it sounds like a scam. That
sounds like a scam. Yeah. But no, I think even researching the topic, for one, you think I guess there's kind of enough expenses enough to worry about when we're alive, and
that's right. Yeah.
And the cost of I was actually reading one article, and kind of the headline writes itself, but it's like the cost of living is going up, and so is the cost of dying.
Right.
But yeah, I mean you think about there's the funeral, there's the burial plot, the casket, headstone, those types of things. But even beyond that, like I was I found this price list of from a few local kind of funeral home, and it was great. The line, it was like a menu of all these different so there's different packages and all this kind of stuff. But I mean there's stuff like there was the one I found the most surprising, like it costs for them to, I guess, like dig the grave, so they call it like the internment, I think, or like the opening and closing of the grave. And there even have different, like the cost is different depending on the depth you choose. Right. Yeah. And doing that, and depending on the day of the week, like a week, like it's kind of crazy. It's like depending on the day of the week, like if it's it's kind of like
weekend.
It's like doing
wedding. It's like it's like wedding ceremonies.
It's like doing a ceremony on a Thursday instead of a Saturday, right?
Probably the opposite though, where winters would probably be more expensive.
Actually, that was in one of the ones I was looking at. There was a little footnote, and it was saying that in winter months, if the ground is frozen, it could take a longer time to do it. So there's kind of an upcharge for that too and stuff. So yeah, a lot of it's not
a lot of fees. Yeah,
a lot of fees. Yeah,
and what that does make the topic tough to simplify too, because you look at it and it's so customizable.
It is,
and it's hard to determine what's needed to cover, like what you have to pay, and then what's an option. And
it's also really regional too.
Yes, that too as well. Yeah,
especially I found when it came to like the cost of like the plot, right? Because if you're in looking for a plot in like a major urban area like Toronto, essentially, then where as opposed to kind of a smaller town, like it can range from 1,000 to 20,000, kind of, it seemed like.
Jeez, the cost of land, right?
Yep.
So today, as best we can, we'll try to simplify it, or at least go through all the details so that you have an idea of what to expect when that day comes for all of us.
Yeah, that's right.
And a very, very morbid topic today.
It is.
So in terms, we'll start with the cost of a traditional funeral because it's probably the easiest place to start. Again, we'll talk about even the options there and the alternatives. But with a traditional funeral, there are the typical costs you would expect with a cemetery. So buying the casket, the actual thing that your loved one is buried in, the headstone, the plot of land like we talked about. But there are a lot of costs that are in addition to that, like we mentioned, that you might not expect just from the cemetery itself. So where the loved one ends up being buried. So you have to pay for the right to the land, like we mentioned, which gives you a permanent right for the burial. So it's not rent, it's not land ownership. You're paying for a right to this land. Like we mentioned, there's a cost to open and close the grave, so excavating and refilling. Also, apparently, there's charges for resodding the grass I saw as well.
Interesting.
Which I guess makes sense, but again, feels tedious that they have those as line items. There's payment for installing the headstone. So you actually have to pour foundation when you put a headstone. This is all stuff I'm learning, by the way. This is not just industry knowledge, I should say. General ideas in terms of probate and taxes, but in terms of the cemetery stuff, we did research a lot of this stuff. There's also, importantly, cemetery upkeep. So a good chunk of the fees that you get charged, whether implicit or explicit, are actually to fund the maintenance of the cemetery as a whole. So cemeteries actually have something called either an endowment care or perpetual care fund. It's almost like insurance in the sense that you have this pool of money that you accumulate. It's invested, it's managed to grow over time. And then from that pool of money, the company pulls money to cover maintenance costs. So that's mowing the grass and maintaining the cemetery in a good state. And because there's this sort of indefinite period of time, that's why they take that fund approach, because there's such a long liability with that. And that also increases the cost of burying a cemetery because you're paying for the maintenance of the ground indefinitely, effectively.
I think that's part of that's got to be kind of regulated in a way, I guess.
It is, yeah. So there are regulations about the fund, how much has to be maintained, things like that. That I know because I researched a cemetery investment opportunity. Yeah, it's funny enough. So
which one was that? Is it because it was Park Lawn was a Canadian
maybe that's
one,
what it was.
And they've been taken private. I think
actually.
So.
Yeah, I think that was the one.
Yeah.
So
because there's a big U.S. and that's the thing. That's what I was looking to, and we. One of the ones I used as an example here in Ottawa, they're actually like a cooperative or it's actually a not-for-profit, and it's still, but then with that, it was very expensive. But I'm sure, and I've read some interesting articles too about and I guess one thing that I found, I was like, I'm going through this and these price lists, these options and whatever, and you're seeing these costs and these different things, and you're like, wow, it was like complex.
Yeah.
And there's so many different options and choices and so many different things I didn't even really understand what they were. You could talk about these menu of different things. And it was like, there's upgrade for headstone cleaning. They have a charge for heads, and you can do gardening, annual gardening
for flower
beds. And there's all these different things. And so I could see how there's a lot of overwhelming choices for our loved ones that, do, but I think that's why there's a lot of pre-planning options and stuff too, right?
And that's a good point to touch on. There are other costs I'll quickly mention as well, but one thing you're seeing is these cemeteries and funeral homes and selling prepaid packages, so that if you know, and well, actually, I don't know how far early you could do. I guess you and I could possibly go buy a package today for ourselves.
2 for 1.
2 for 1, maybe. Yeah, we'll see. It might be a good deal. Who knows?
Dead man coffin.
That's right. Yeah. But you can buy these packages so that everything's sorted beforehand, before you obviously have to deal with grief and setting up these services and payment. Yeah. All things to consider. But interestingly, I found this out in Ontario. There's also a $30 Bereavement Authority of Ontario Consumer Protection fee, which is basically a tax started in 2023. $30 towards the government regulation of the space. So lots of different
an airport
fees.
Improvement fee.
That's right, basically, yeah.
Wow.
And one that I found really interesting, because I just wasn't aware this was a thing, is something called a casket vault.
I read about that too.
Yeah. So because wood rots in the ground, and that could present a hazard for people walking in a cemetery if the ground gives out beneath them, you actually have to, typically, it depends on the rules of the cemetery you go to, but you have to encase your casket in something. So there are either metal or concrete casket vaults that you have to also pay for when you bury your loved one at a cemetery. Again, depending on the rules they have there. So lots of costs associated with a traditional funeral, and those can themselves be thousands of dollars.
Yeah, those that's what, looking through the price list, that's what I was like, casket vault.
That's right.
I was like, is that like a
little bank they store you in? Yeah, that's right.
That's right. And then and because I think the prices were like $3,000 to $6,000 or $7,000 just alone for that casket vault.
That's right. So it adds up very quickly.
Yeah.
So then it comes to the averages of what do these things cost, and I know you looked into a few numbers there.
Yeah, I mean it like, especially in Canada, and I think in the States as well, like really it varies regionally, like province by province, but it really varies kind of city to city, depending on that kind of stuff. Yeah, but I mean, so I think the burial plot itself, like it kind of ranged from like, I think the averages that they give is like between 1,500 to 20,000 up to 20,000. So that's just like
huge range.
Yeah,
that's
it's
crazy.
a big range, right? Yeah. And I was looking actually, I think some of it is city regulated potentially, because as soon as you start looking, like it was like city of Brampton, city of whatever, these are the things, and they kind of range thousands to, and then you would even like in Toronto and stuff, that's when you're getting pretty pricey.
Tens of thousands, sure.
Yeah. Like caskets, like the one price list I found, like caskets, they range from like 2,000 to 15,000. I think the one that and I mean, it was very basic from kind of exactly.
TV in there.
The other interesting thing was they even had casket rental.
Interesting.
Which because at first I was like, I don't understand
how did that work.
Yeah, but I think it's for the viewing, so you would rent, but the casket rental was $2,000. And I think because this is a little speculation, but obviously the $15,000 casket, very kind of ornate and plush looking and all that kind of stuff, but it's then it gets buried. So there are like cheaper options, and they even have kind of more like really like the kind of, this might sound bad, but
a box,
the pine box kind of thing that you see on the old westerns and stuff. That's
for the actual burial.
And then you rent, but even that, thousands of bucks just to rent and stuff. And
Let's go to Home Depot.
And then same thing, headstones, like there's, I think we have enough knowledge now. We can almost start our own,
at this point, yeah.
But like they call them grave markers. So that's kind of the flat in the ground.
Yeah.
And then the actual headstones, and depending on the material, but ranging from 1,000 to, again, 10, whatever, depending on how big and ornate. So those are very, very. But I found that the average, I think the stats were like the actual average was like between $7,000 to $25,000. I think for the whole funeral, like so the funeral, burial, all that kind of stuff, and,
right.
That includes like transport of the body up to X amount of kilometers and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's I actually, funny enough, for one of my videos, I borrowed a headstone from an Ottawa headstone seller. I don't know what the proper term is. Yeah, I'll throw up their names just as free marketing, because they let me use it for free, which is very generous of them. But the other thing too is they're very heavy. I had a tiny one as a prop for a video.
Yeah, they're like granite or marble.
It's solid stone, and it took like I carried it, and by the time I had to film, I was still like so sweaty from lugging this thing. It was tiny, like maybe 10 inches kind of width. But it was, so a lot of work goes into even moving those parts as well because of that aspect. Yeah. And it adds up quickly. And I think part of the 25,000 fee you talked about as kind of the average or the cost includes other things as well.
Right.
So most of what we talked about is just the cemeteries. Another aspect is the funeral home itself. So you have to remember that the cemetery is where the loved one is buried. The funeral home is where the deceased person is prepared. Right. You have services, so that can be the wake and things of that sort. Yeah. and transportation and things like that. And sometimes a funeral home works with the cemetery. Sometimes they're separate. And I'm not sure what the rules are in terms of exclusivity. I know caskets you can sometimes bring your own or purchase from a different person and then use at a funeral home and cemetery, but you'll have to look into the rules for each one. But with the funeral homes, there are 3 basic costs that come with their services. The first one being service fees. So that can be coordinating the ceremonies, actual documentation of the death, because there's government involved with that as well. Transportation costs, like you mentioned, of the deceased to and from the funeral home, as well as additional transportation if you get a hearse and I don't know what the term is, but procession to the funeral by family members and the like. Embalming and preparation of the deceased as well, as you'd expect. And staff services during any wake events or things of that sort. The second thing is product charges. So like we mentioned, the casket and urns, they can often be purchased through funeral homes, but you might have to or might be able to purchase from another supplier. And then there's disbursements. So typically, as part of their package, funeral homes will also cover a bunch of other tedious expenses and then charge you in one bill for this stuff. So that can be municipal death registration fees. You have to register to be dead. Coroner's fees, crematorium fees. I think I'm saying that right. Yeah. Church fees if a church is involved, and newspaper notices. So a lot of kind of smaller fees involved with that, and probably not the meaningful chunk of expenses, but all those things come with admin fees and kind of one-off charges here and there. So all stuff to consider when looking at a traditional funeral.
Right? Funeral, yeah, and it kind of depends on. Again, I think I'm sure location and whatever. There's lots of factors, and the price ranges, and that's what again I kind of mentioned it before, but what I found was just it's like you don't just go, and that's we've all been to funerals, and I know they vary in kind of size, and sometimes it's at the church, sometimes the whole thing's maybe at kind of a full service funeral home or whatever, but just the sheer amount of options, and to kind of be serious, like I've dealt with, over the years, having, and it's obviously devastating when a family member passes, but I've been through this with clients, and client spouses or family members, and, working with executors, like we'll kind of talk about all the stuff when it comes to probate and taxes a little bit later, but it's not, obviously you're it's a tough time. I mean, you're grieving, you're going through this, but then there's so much to do, and there's so many choices and so many this, and then looking at this, I'm like, I can't imagine, and this isn't to knock the industry at all, because I don't know the industry well, but we don't know the economics, like, this, there's, at least the one I was looking at, like it was pricey, but it's a not-for-profit. Like they have lots of other tons of resources guides, and I'm sure there are lots of good ones out there, but knowing that there's some of these kind of publicly traded for-profit kind of now large entities, you see there's kind of a lot of money in, and they say an unlimited amount of clients really, but like when, if you're dealing with, losing a loved one, you're dealing with all the other financial aspects and impacts, and oftentimes if maybe it was sudden, it wasn't expected. Yeah. And now you go and you're dealing with it, and it's like, okay, here's a list of 1,000 choices you need to make, and each one has a different cost.
And a quick turnaround too.
Very quick
turnaround. Most funerals are within 2 weeks of the person passing away, right? So, and part of that is likely because the longer you wait, the higher the cost of storing the body.
I think so, it was. That was the thing. It was like charges for body for storage for that, and like. But I mean, even part of it, I remember looking at it, kind of remind me. I mean, it's been, how long ago was I married? But I mean, I remember, my wife and I, when we got married 20 plus years ago, you're making all those decisions, and like, it's like, even with the food, like there's all the different choices for food. And it was the same, like looking here, like if you want to have, they have all these different food. In fact, they have alcohol packages and stuff if you want to serve that at the funeral. And, so I can imagine. So I guess, not only is this a topical thing for us because of our whatever, but I think it is important. It is important, at all aspects.
Very
like
under-discussed.
I think it is. It is, because it's a kind of a crappy thing to plan for. We enjoy, being financial planners and financial, advisors, portfolio managers. It's fun to plan for retirement and help clients reach those objectives. But, you know, I think having this stuff taken care of too it is part of the discussion. So, but yeah, I found, you know, and maybe we can put up on the screen or link it. I don't know how that all the technology.
Yeah, I'll throw it up on screen. We can do anything these days.
Nice.
And for podcast listeners, I'll have a link. But
okay.
Obviously not as intuitive.
Can you like high tech flash it like 80s kind of like
transition? Sure.
Yeah.
We can do anything.
Nice.
Just for you though. Never doing this again.
Yeah, I'm not that tech forward, I guess. But I found one, and it was kind of their middle of the road package from that same, you know, funeral home I was looking for. And they're a funeral home that's kind of attached to they have a cemetery. They're kind of, I guess, all one full service. But kind of they call it their traditions package, and all in, you know, this didn't include any kind of food or anything, but it did have like space for the reception and staff and all the other kind of, they call their professional services, which you'd mentioned as far as like what that kind of includes. But it basically was 10K.
Right. And that's without the cemetery.
That's
the
services. That's the service. So that's like, yeah, that's exactly what you said. So that would include kind of the funeral itself and you know, this use of their space and the service, like no food or anything for reception. Like that would all be kind of an additional, but they call the professional services, like the legal stuff, all that kind of for the whole funeral. And that was 10K.
Right.
And then the same place, it was another, depending on the lot, like 6 to 15K for the plot, plus, you know, another whatever for the casket. You know, so yeah, it is. And
just some of the line items here are interesting. So, like we said, the facility for sheltering remains up to 5 days, basically $400.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of money to kind of stall and have to plan this stuff out. $400 every 5 days. Yeah. Embalming, most pleasant one to talk about. Yeah. $625. And then the staff services, you see a couple $1,000 charges because you obviously have to pay for people to manage the site for you. And like we said, that doesn't include the burial plot or the casket. So maybe you found some numbers there as
it was like
we've
from
talked
them.
about that.
Yeah, we talked a bit about it, but it was between, like, I think for them, like the kind of low end was 2,000, and then it was up to, I think their most expensive was like 15 or for a casket. Right. Yeah. But even like, you know, we'll talk about like there's the cremation option. But even that, like the urns are still, you know, you can buy an urn and there's that. And like just a lot of these things, you know, so I think it was for a cremation one, it'd be a little, like they're a little bit less on average. But according to Sun Life, the average cost of a traditional funeral with the burial in Canada is up to 25,000, like between 5 to 25. And so another stat I found, so then the average cost of cremation, so a service that includes, is still like 7K.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the cheap option.
That's the cheaper option. Yeah.
There's also I know there's also crypt options. So crypt, if you aren't familiar, is kind of a structure where basically sort of like it's like a shared burial site basically. Right. So if you see sort of a door in a cemetery, like a structure you can walk into, that's typically a crypt that leads to a large area that people can be buried. Yeah. That's a cheaper option as well. But as you can see, a lot of costs with these services, and it adds up. Like we said.
One like, we talk about the increased costs. I was looking at kind of the data into the kind of, you know, and this is a Canadian stat, but it was very similar in the US, was, you know, the difference between like a traditional burial or a cremation. And so one of the things I found was that, so in Canada, the cremation rate was just under 48%. So like less than half.
That's quite high, though.
It's still quite high, but less than half were being cremated. So it's about, this was 2000, and I bet you if you look even farther back, it'd be much higher kind of traditional burial versus with cremation. But, so 22 years later, so in 2022, it climbed to 74%.
Oh, wow.
So it went from 48% to 74% cremation. Right. And I'm sure part of it's just kind of an acceptance thing. Like maybe one was, maybe like religious or whatever reason, it wasn't maybe as common, but I think, cost driven, because it is a cheaper option. So, and I think it was the same kind of consideration
Right.
in the U.S. But yeah,
So majority of
it's like
funerals
75
are cremation now.
Cremation now, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense. Like you look at the cost difference, and to the point that we've talked about, that when people don't plan for this, all of a sudden you're faced with the decision of, like you said, $6,000 cremation service or $7,000 cremation, or $25,000 funeral, right?
Yeah.
If you haven't prepared for this, some people might not have a choice, right, between which they choose. So, but definitely traditional funerals almost kind of being squeezed out. Slowly becoming less and less common.
Yeah.
So those are the costs we've talked. So the costs we've talked about have been explicitly, again, related to the death of the person, preparing them, services, place you put them. But there is also other costs of dying as well, which, again, probably less thought about. But the two big ones worth discussing, and then we'll talk about taxes, which is an additional one. But end-of-life medical costs, which, again, a lot of people wouldn't consider, and any financial and legal matters. So altogether in the U.S., the average cost of dying is around $24,000, $24,204 in 2023, according to Forbes Advisor. So that's inclusive of these three expenses. Total cost includes a median funeral cost of about $7,736. So a lot less than kind of the huge higher cost we saw with some of the stats we were pulling, but that's a median funeral cost. Average end-of-life medical expenses of roughly $16,468. So a huge expense on that side. Very lucky in Canada with the universal healthcare, right? So not as much of a consideration for Canadians.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I found, looking at the difference and seeing the numbers. That was one. You just, again, we don't really think of that. Like, it's just kind of, you don't really think of what those would be here and planning for that aspect. I mean, there's enough costs obviously here, but yeah, that was
more than the funeral.
More than the funeral,
And it makes sense intuitively when you have to think about it. Someone who is end of life has a lot of care needs, and especially if they're older, where they have less motor function and things like that. And again, very sad topic, but something to be aware of when discussing finances. Something less so thought about in Canada. So that $16,000 fee is a big charge that has to also be considered. And then according to the Forbes report, another nearly $10,000 coming from managing the deceased's estate, legal and financial matters. So things like disposing of real estate. So actually selling real estate comes with the cost as well. So managing that stuff. With about $4,384 related to financial matters and nearly $5,000 to legal matters. And all of that naturally significantly influences the final expense that you have to pay for burying or paying for the funeral of a loved one. So yeah, it's a lot of costs, even out. So first of all, funeral costs are expensive as it is. And then you have these other considerations, end of life medical, and then the financial and legal matters that come with it. So it adds up.
Yeah. I think it goes to show that, I think some planning in advance makes sense. And I've even you talk about the kind of planning less directly about kind of funerals and kind of final expenses, but even when it comes to probate and estate taxes and stuff, I think that's something a lot of people start to consider. Well, they don't want to burden someone with like when they pass, because I mean, some take that out. It's like, well, I'm dead, so
you guys deal with it.
You deal with it. Like,
I'm out. Yeah.
But I think a lot of and I've dealt with this with clients. It starts to be kind of, I think, as you age, it's something you think of more and more, and it's just a burden you maybe don't want to leave somebody. But I mean, we were talking about another stat that I found, just because we're talking about like cost of living is a big kind of topic now. But so the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they found, so this is a bit older of a stat, but between 1986 and 2017, caskets, like the price of a casket, rose 230% compared to the average, sort of the standard cost of living over that same time period rose 135%. So almost 100%
more expensive
more
to die.
Yeah, that's right. And so
So that's over roughly 30 years, 230. Yeah, more than
Percent,
doubling
yeah.
the. Geez, that's
Yeah, and that's just the casket, and and if we look at like especially burial and stuff, like you look at the land, like you'd have to assume that it would be as high, if not higher, even just for that kind of stuff too. So yeah.
So we've gone over the cost of funeral. We've gone over medical, these extra considerations. Now it's worth talking about death and taxes, and probate specifically, but as well as estate taxes, which is a topic we don't have in Canada. We don't have estate taxes explicitly.
Yeah.
I think probate has been labeled an estate tax or a death tax.
In Ontario, it's called like they don't even call it in probate technically in Ontario anymore. It's actually called like EAT or estate administration tax.
I see. Okay.
So it is kind of, whereas like a traditional estate tax, like, and again, I'm not an expert when it comes to estate tax in the U.S.
Right.
But there is like an explicit estate tax.
Yeah.
As far as like there is a tax when assets pass from one generation to another. Right. Now, there's a lot of planning opportunities that go around that. There's a lot of use of trusts and other kind of stuff to do it. Plus, there's exemptions when it comes to passing to spouses. There's exemptions of now like kind of what the total U.S. situs assets, they call it, like as far as like
what's located
in the U.S. and again, it's quite complicated, so we're not going to get into that. But there is cases like there is an explicit like a state tax, like so it actually has a tax, whereas in Canada it's a little bit different. There's no tax directly on the passing of an asset from but it is indirect because and we can get into the tax aspect a little bit first and then we can get into kind of probate and what probate actually is really, or what it's intended for. But in Canada, basically the minute you pass away, it's as if everything you owned, you sell.
Yeah, deemed disposition.
It's called a deemed disposition. So then on your final return, on your final tax return, which is, would be done by your estate, executor or trustee, or your final return, any tax owing on that deemed disposition would become, owing or payable on your final return. So if you own a large non-registered portfolio with a big, taxable capital gain, even though maybe my estate says I want to pass those to those securities to my adult children, and your estate can actually pass those securities as is, so they can transfer them in kind. So even if you have a large portfolio of whatever shares and they transfer to my kids or someone, and they don't actually sell them, but on that day of death, it's as if they were sold. Yeah. And so then any gain that would be taxable in my final return. Now there's a spousal rollover. So you can roll over assets to spouses on death and kind of delay that. But
spouse being the biggest one, the biggest kind of delay of that. But beyond spouse, there's not much.
Not much. There's some spousal trusts and other stuff where you can use to kind of delay that as well, but for the most part, so there is. So it's not like an explicit, this is an estate tax, but it is a tax that arises
from death.
Essentially, right?
Yeah. So that can be stocks that you hold. Real estate is a big one in Canada that gets a lot of people as well, because one consideration from a tax planning standpoint is that because everything is based on income tax brackets in Canada anyway, the more of a taxable income or whatever you have at death, the higher your tax rate. So one issue that a lot of Canadians face is that at death, and this was what that story about the, again, I'm missing the amount, but it was definitely in the upper hundreds of thousands of dollars that this family faced because I think their mother had passed away. Is from real estate, because you see this massive gain in cottages. In Canada, your principal residence that you designate in your taxes is tax exempt from capital gains tax. So the home you live in and designate as your primary residence won't face that tax. But cottages and these secondary properties, any gain they've seen over their lifetime is taxed as a capital gain. So if you have a family that bought a cottage, 50 years ago, you all of a sudden, especially with how crazy real estate has been, if it's in a ideal enough area, you have this hundreds of thousands of dollars of tax liability or taxable income, I guess, that then you see this massive tax charge come. So real estate's a big one in Canada that a lot of people don't plan around and then see this big hit as a result. But also to your point, capital gains on stocks,
Yeah.
things like that. Everything is taxed as income on the date of death or in that year.
Yeah. And the thing with stuff like a cottage, and that's where kind of the idea of it being disposed of, like deemed disposed of, and having tax arise from it, where you can run into some issues, or your estate technically can run into issues when it comes to liquidity, because you may plan to have that cottage, and I think this isn't uncommon. I want my cottage to pass down to my children.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, my cottage, I paid $50,000 for it. Now it's worth $1 million because it's in a real hot area, whatever. All fine and dandy. My kids, it's going to pass to them. They're going to get this cottage. All is fine and dandy. But you have, say
$200,000 tax bill.
You
or
have a $200,000 tax bill, but you didn't actually sell the cottage. So so unless there's liquid assets in the estate to pay that tax bill, so that can pass, that can cause some issues. So there may not actually even be. There may not even be funds to cover that. And so how's that estate then going to cover that tax liability? And so there can be kind of issues that way.
Yeah, especially because even if you view, well, I'll just sell the real estate, being able to sell the real estate in time, right, is also a consideration, because the longer this tax liability is outstanding, there can be fees associated with that. Yeah. So that's a consideration as well. And probably what most people run into is that issue of you've owned this cottage, you don't have any other money in the estate, and now you have $100,000 tax liability. The government obviously has taken the view, well, you own an asset that's now worth $1 million. You should be able to cover this expense. But to your point, if you don't have the liquidity in the estate otherwise, it causes quite a bit of an issue. So housing is one of the biggest considerations.
In Canada, it can also be like registered accounts, like RIFs, like RSPs and RIFs too, because unless that's transferring to you, unless you have your spouse, like unless it's going to your spouse and it's rolling over, something like a RIF. And a lot of times if you didn't have a pension or what you've saved, you've clients with, million or more in RIFs, and on the date of passing, that entire amount becomes taxable. So if you have a RIF that's $1 million and it's not passing to a spouse, that entire amount becomes taxable. Highest marginal rate in Canada, in Ontario, is 50%. It's 53.3%, I think, right now. And so that means, close to half of that could be wiped out, right? And so, so like, and there's a lot of, like, that's what, working with a good advisor too, and tax accountant, whatever you want, when you're doing your estate planning, part of it maybe, there are clients and it can be, depending on your tax rate leading up, like where you might actually start taking out more than you need from a RIF. Cause I'd rather pay maybe a little more tax every year on taking out more than my minimum RIF withdrawal, so that I avoid kind of getting stuck, my estate getting stuck with that kind of 53% tax bill, right? So
it's so when we talk about estate planning, tax is a big part of that, and it's worthwhile, like you mentioned, to spread out that tax liability in the years. Obviously, the tough aspect of it is we don't know when that date comes, right? Yeah. But as clients get older, you get an idea of what they need to survive, and the fact that in 10 to 15 years that date will likely come. Right. So you see them, we plan like based on, as best we can, what we view as probability of when they'll pass away. And you might even do it more aggressively than you otherwise need, because you don't know when that date will come. So
even if they don't need the money to spend, you'd rather pay tax now at 35 or 40% than so you'll pull like a fifth
or anywhere from a quarter. I've seen, well, in one case there was a client who pulled a third of their account every year because they hadn't dealt with this until this point, and all of a sudden had to pull this money out to avoid a massive tax liability. And just entering those, taxing at a lower tax bracket really makes a meaningful difference by the time you pass away. So part of tax planning as well, and then also we talk about the special types of accounts. We mentioned RIF for our non-Canadian viewers, our main retirement kind of pension equivalent.
It'd be like a 401k,
similar to a 401k when you are withdrawing it in Canada, at least by the age of 71, if not earlier. Your account has to convert to this type of account called a RIF. So your RRSP, Registered Retirement Savings Plan, turns into a Registered Retirement Income Fund. Where you're forced every year to withdraw a certain percentage of the account at a minimum. So that's just making sure that people who have saved for retirement are not just delaying taxes indefinitely. They have to pull some, recognize that as income. And so the strategy, again, with estate planning is to pull out more than you need, depending on your circumstance, to make sure that if you pass away unexpectedly or even within expectation, that you're not doing that all at once. It's not a lump sum recognition. So those are kind of the estate taxes. And on the U.S. side, we mentioned, and it's also consideration for Canadians who own assets in the U.S., but there's an explicit estate tax that's charged across, I think it's the whole value of the market value, right?
Yeah, I think it's up to but there is and
exemptions.
There's always exemptions and like that. I know that's kind of varied. I think right now I haven't checked, but I'm pretty sure it's pretty high. So like, I know it's
graduated like 17 to 40% or something like that. Like it's a graduated
like the
system.
rate's pretty high. The tax rate's really, I think, is pretty high. Excuse me, but like the exemption as far as
the exemption,
like how big as long as your total worldwide estate, and there's a couple different things, but I think as long as your total worldwide estate is below a certain amount, and I know at one point I think the exemption was like 3 million.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't, and it's kind of, and that changes, and they kind of, again, I think it's kind of a political thing, like the,
Yeah.
But but it does exist, and so it does, it is something, and so I think, there's even more, especially if you're a very high net worth estate in the U.S. I think there's a lot of tax planning and estate planning that's done to kind of avoid that as much as possible. So that's the tax. And then again, we talked a bit about probate. And like, again, probate's kind of considered a tax here, like it's called in Ontario. It is called a state administration tax, but it's not a tax on the transfer, the market. It is more in the market value. But really, what probate is, the way I think of probate anyway, is essentially probate is just kind of the overall, like in Ontario, the way it's viewed is it's basically the cost for the government to validate your estate and to say that your estate is like valid and that how it's to be distributed is valid. Yeah. And so
it's a processing fee.
It's basically a processing fee for dying, that's really. And a way to like kind of for them to legally put their stamp on and say, okay, this is a valid estate. Yeah. And these assets can then pass as per this will is essentially what it is. And like, and I found in the States, because the same thing, but I was looking, and so I found a kind of a note of what components are of probate costs in the U.S. So it might be a little bit different, but so there's court fees, filing fees, attorney fees, executor fees, appraisal fees. So that'd be like determining value of assets and stuff if it needs to be, notifications, asset sale costs. Those are, but like but the probate costs in U.S. it varies much by state in the U.S. too, but they say the average is typically between 3% and 7% of an estate's value. Okay, which it's quite pretty significant. Yeah. I think it was Alaska had the highest probate. Yeah,
I wouldn't have thought that.
And then Hawaii was number 2. That's what I remember reading. But yeah, and then in Canada, it really varies province by province in Canada. Ontario, I mean, there's kind of a formula, but really it essentially works out to about 1.5%. Right. And that's just that's just the cost that goes into. So that doesn't cover like what you'd pay a lawyer or the trustee fees or anything like that. This is just literally the fee that goes to the government, for the government, for them to be like, yes, and put their stamp of probate. And like a lot of times, like assets passing through a will, like a bank account or an asset at a bank or those types of things, like they won't release that asset until they have not just a copy of the will, but they need a probated copy of the will. That's kind of the
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So they'll say, well, I need a probated copy of the will because that kind of releases the liability of the bank or whoever to say, well, no, like, okay, now the Ontario government said, yep, this is a valid will. Yeah. Everything looks good. You can release that asset, right? And it costs. And so, 1.5%, but if you're talking like $1 million or $2 million estate, like that adds up. Yeah. Some provinces, I think on Alberta has just a flat fee, and I think it's like $500. So their probate costs are a little low. Doesn't mean you don't want to still avoid probate at times because
as best you can,
best you can because there's time and stuff like that. But yeah.
So one aspect, and this is a bit of a divergence from the topic of the cost of dying, but one part of estate planning as well is setting out your will and figuring out beneficiaries and the like. So types of accounts like RRSPs, and I believe the 401k as well in the US, but they can have designated beneficiaries so that they bypass these probate fees. Yeah.
Meaning, they say it passes outside of the estate, so it can pass directly via the.
So you don't have to. So the bank when you pass away, you've already pre-designated
Right.
this person will be receiving the funds from my RRSP.
Right.
So the probate doesn't have to charge a fee on
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Another aspect to consider is that highly recommend everyone have a will,
Yes.
especially if you have loved ones.
Yeah. Absolutely.
If you don't have a will at the time of death, the government effectively decides who gets what asset,
Yeah.
and that can still be a costly. There's a
can.
cost
and
associated
then
with that as well.
it's the time too.
The time, yeah.
The time too, because that's not a swift process. So it's called dying intestate, and it's yeah. So basically, the court has to step in. They will, someone, they'll, and then
There's like a stated formula of sorts.
and
Like,
again,
it's
it is
like-
very provincial too in Canada anyway, and I would assume very state specific in the U.S. But there is kind of a way they do it in a formula that they try. But again, it's going to take time. They will try to find somebody that would step in to become, and they have the power to appoint an executor, but if not, then they could bring in, so it just adds time. Like a estates to settle, I think one of the stats I found in the US, I think the average was up to like 20 months
Oh wow!
to
Yeah, a year
settle,
and a
to
half.
fully settle
Yeah.
estate. And sadly, it's something we deal with in our business. Every year having clients or, loved ones of clients pass away and having to kind of go, we're a big part of that process, because oftentimes it's, we'll hold the financial assets that will be, transferred to either spouses or other beneficiaries.
Yeah.
So we're part of that process. And, even a very simple estate can still take months and months and months. And
So will simplifies all
the
that.
will does help simplify it. Yeah.
Part of it as well, you mentioned it with executor fees, but part of your will is designating. So the executor is the person who manages your will or carries it out.
Yeah.
So that means they manage the money you have. Your will also specifies the rights and rules they have to follow.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you have a son that you want to have inherit money, but you want to have a trustee manage that money up to a certain age, that's all details you have to specify. So if they're under the age of 18 or what have you, those are things you have to specify in your will. So a lot of details to go over.
Yeah, you can actually create a trust via your will.
Yeah.
And so that
Testamentary trust.
So that your will actually outlines, names the trustee, that kind of stuff, so that you have that as part of your will.
So very important part of estate planning.
Yeah.
And again, you designate your executor, so whether it be a loved one or you can hire a professional. But the point being that if you don't specify an executor, the courts will bring in an executor, and there's typically a fee that's paid for an executor.
There is.
I also, in your will, you can compensate your executor.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon to say X
They
amount
can
will
if they
go
want,
to the executor to compensate for their time.
Oftentimes they won't take it, but they can.
Yeah, that can be
it can be a clause in there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So with wills, that's the probate is to verify wills. The other weird thing is wills obviously can be contested.
Yeah.
There's that legal process, so people fight over wills quite often.
Yeah.
They argue that different agreements have been reached. So that's why you have probate as well.
Yeah.
And even things like having different dated wills. So if you date a will in 2017, but then you write a new will in 2024, 2025, then the courts have to confirm which one is accurate. It's whatever is the most recent is typically the one taken, but there are considerations and legal fights that can happen there. So all things, spouses will come and fight, and extended family members will come for their piece of pie, right? So all things to consider with the probate process. But like you mentioned, in Canada, RRSP, the RIF, which is the retirement version of the RRSP, the tax-free savings account, life insurance policies, certain trusts, and pensions with designated beneficiaries are not charged probate fees because they, again, have explicit beneficiary details.
Right. Unless you name your estate as a beneficiary.
Unless you name your estate, and then they will go to
then
probate.
it goes through your estate.
Yeah. And I don't know if we've clarified, but estate is just the body, the entity that absorbs all your assets when you pass away. So think of it, company's a wrong term, but think of it as like a thing, this entity that's now a legal thing that is the container of all your things when you pass away.
Yeah.
So anything that goes into your estate when you pass away and doesn't bypass it is going to be charged this probate fee.
And then that's what your executor is in charge of, using the will as guidance to distribute all those assets as per the wishes in the will. Yeah. And so an executor is kind of bound by essentially a fiduciary to the beneficiaries of that will. But yeah, like the importance of the will is because if you don't have a will, then your assets are going to be passed via kind of the provincial or state regulations, and that may be different than you want.
Yeah.
So the only way to really ensure that all your assets and stuff are kind of distributed in the manner that you want. The will is really the only way to do that. And then, they recommend with wills, especially, is anytime there's life changes, anything, if you get married, have kids,
you update it.
Whatever, new assets, other assets, grandkids, stuff like that, you want to always review and get that.
Yeah. And I would say too, there's a lot of online free will templates you can use. I think that's a bare minimum.
I think
if you have, if you're like, I'm about to go travel.
Yeah.
Honestly, whenever I travel, I update my will just in case.
Yeah.
But if you're like, I'm going to go on a plane, I want to quickly set up a will, that's better than nothing.
Yeah.
But my advice would be to speak to a lawyer.
Yeah.
A lot of lawyers actually do it for free as like a goodwill gesture because they want you to be they want to manage your estate when you pass away, right?
Yeah.
And usually family members will go to the lawyer who helped prepare the will.
Yeah.
But I would definitely, there might be a cost associated with it, but I would think it's worth it if you have a large estate or a lot of assets in your name that you want to manage, because they'll help you determine all the specific clauses you need to include, the extra considerations, because you have to think about, how am I going to fund taxes for my real estate? Do I want my money invested in the estate while it's being sorted out? So you can set rules of this will be invested based on these criteria, because you can invest estate assets. Very high tax rate. So any money earned by an estate, I believe, is taxed at the highest income rate in Canada. So it's not to say it's like an efficient investment vehicle, but the point is if you have cash sitting there for a period of time for a liability, you can even specify how the executor is to invest the funds or the proceeds of the estate in the meantime. So definitely a consideration with wills and a big part of this planning. So those are the cost of dying effectively is the explicit cost of what it takes, what you have to do with the body once you pass away, the service costs and all that associated with it. Like we mentioned in the US, the medical costs that come with it, the financial and legal considerations, and then the taxes, because the government wants a cut when you pass away. You got to pay on the way out.
They got to pay on the way out. Surprised there isn't like a birth tax actually now.
That's right. Yeah, you enter this world, like, here's your $500 admin fee, right? I guess in the U.S. there is, right, for hospital costs.
That's a good point.
Like,
yeah.
But we're privileged. We haven't thought about that as a baby.
I know.
But so in terms of managing these expenses or how
actually,
to plan
you know what
for
though,
it,
I'm assuming when people in the U.S. hear that we're talking about having potential tax rates income tax rates of over 50%, they're probably like, you pay for it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's paid a different way.
It's paid a different way.
So in terms of how to plan for these things, obviously there are certain things you can't control, but like we mentioned, there are prepaid packages you can look into that might even save you money if you do it beforehand. In terms of the funeral expenses, also worth exploring what you would be interested in, what you in terms of your own ceremony, discussing those with loved ones and those that would be in charge of this stuff. Like we mentioned, setting up a will helps tremendously with estate management and even can help with the taxes and the side of it. If you have registered accounts, looking into setting beneficiaries, taking advantage of all the things that exist. TFSA has successor holders, for example. Your spouse can take over your account with a rollover so that there's no tax. And that's the case with real estate as well, is you can have these rollovers where if you live in the same house, not with all types of real estate, but if you live in the same house, the ownership changes to the joint owner or can move to the spouse without that deemed disposition. So all things worth considering and thinking about with the tax planning process. And it's also one of the costs that I think justify life insurance policies. So I'm not a tremendous, I'm not crazy about permanent life insurance policies or things like that. But I think for term policies, if you don't have the money for it, you can get a very cheap term policy to cover a few tens of thousands of dollars in case of funeral expenses, because that is an explicit fee that comes up with death. Also, if you have a large tax liability when you pass away, if you have a cottage, for example, I think a big part of estate planning is looking into insurance policies to make sure that when you pass away, there will be money left over to cover those tax liabilities if you want those things to be passed on.
Right.
Because if you have a cottage that's going to come with a $200,000 tax liability, but you don't have the assets elsewhere to cover it, then that's a situation where I think life insurance would be something to look into. There's a lot you have to be careful with life insurance. There's a lot of investment style life insurance products you have to be super careful with. But there are also very cheap standard policies like term and the like, where you pay for what you get, and that it's expensive. It's a cost, right? A monthly expense you have to look into, but all part of estate planning, all things to consider. Anything else you want to add in terms of cost of dying?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered it. It's overwhelming.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's like your point. It is a menu, and
Yeah.
I think that's a tough thing. I mean, even if to look at the prepackaged stuff, like I haven't given any thought in terms
Yeah.
of honestly,
Because you can prepay, like, you know, it's a lot of people will prepay, or at least like, I think you can go on Facebook Marketplace and
Get a casket
and
is-
get probably. But I know you can. I've seen people sell burial plots before and stuff too.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I know you can. I know like you can buy those in advance.
Okay.
And I think they, you know, there's places will say, like, buy it now. Well, it's cheap, and
Right.
but you have like, because that's what, if you buy a burial plot, you have to then be paying that kind of annual maintenance or whatever the, you know, kind of fee is and stuff. So, but you can prepay that because a lot of times what's all you're trying to do is you're trying to keep that cost and that everything from being somebody else's burden down the road to deal with. And I think there is, and it's hard. I can see why people like to, you know, kind of sometimes avoid it or put it off.
Yeah.
One, I mean, living is expensive enough, and to start putting your capital towards dying, it feels
Feels like a
strange.
waste.
Yeah, it feels like a
Does feel
waste,
like a
right? But at the same time, I think if you can and you have that ability, you know, I think it does.
Yeah.
Give you, you know,
It's hard enough to think about your taxes when you're alive.
Yeah, I know.
Or taxes and debt, debt. Sorry, and,
Debt,
and these different topics. You know, so many people struggle to look at their budget.
That's right.
Let alone budget
Yeah.
for dying.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a prop casket in my garage. I think I might just tell my wife to throw me in that one.
Throw you now, yeah.
Save some money there, a few $1,000s anyway. But that's a discussion of death and taxes and all the other fun costs of dying. If you like the podcast, or video if you're watching us on YouTube, let us know in the comments down below and any thoughts you have on the topic.
Super cheery topic.
That's right. Yeah, it's but it was an interesting one, and I think it's one that, like we said, doesn't get discussed a lot, and people don't think about until it's facing them in the face, until they have to deal with it.
Yeah.
So definitely worth the discussion, and hopefully people found it valuable. If you have any other topics you'd like us to go over, do let us know in the comments down below. Always looking for different topics to discuss, trying to put these out a bit more regularly, but at least for Halloween we knew this was the one to cover.
Yeah.
That's right. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.